Hi, Misha here. And yesterday, at least when I'm recording this yesterday, someone commented on a video that Eaglemoss will be resuming the Battlestar Galactica collection with new issues. I think he said even up to 38. That would be interesting to me because we're at 20. And while I can think of maybe half a dozen other primary ships they could do, I'm having a hard time thinking of 18 in total. So let me start off by saying, what would you like to see? Keeping in mind that these are kind of in the 8 to 10, 8 to 11 inch range, and are $50, $60. So unlike in the original Star Trek where the ships were 15, 20 bucks and smaller, where you could do some odd ones, when you do something like this, it has to have at least some allure to people. So I'd be interested to hear what you think they should do. I have a few I'd like to see, but really I feel like we've been very lucky. Out of the first 20, I'd say at least 16 were real hard hits for me, and even the ones that weren't the best amazing, there's none I really hate. And the only major errors they had was with Scar. Anyway, I just felt like talking about Battlestar Galactica, even though I don't have anything new. I just laid out the 4 Vipers we've received in the collection so far, not counting different repaints. Of course, we have the Mark I, we have the Mark II, the Mark III, and the Mark VII. What about the Mark IV, 5, 6? I don't know. We never really hear about them, so as far as we know, in the universe, they jump from 3 to 7. Noah. Let's just talk about these kind of on a individual basis here. I'm going to straighten my Mark 7 because it's sitting on a wrinkle. There we go. They want it to tump over. So the Mark I is, of course, the original Viper from 1978, Battlestar Galactica, and also featured in the wonderful 1980 Return Galactica 1980. Not the most creative name, but to be fair, not the most creative show. And this was carried over, as most of the original ships were from the original series, to the re-envisioned series. In that series, we don't ever see these flying, but we know they exist in universe. Evan's going to do that now. Great. Quit doing that. I don't know why it's doing that. It's never made that noise before. Might need to grease it. There we go. As I was saying, it was in the original series. This was the primary, really the only colonial fighter we saw. And it was carried over to the reimagined series, and then we saw the model in a museum. But presumably, in universe, it was used before this first Cylon War. And we're going to just talk about the reimagined series in this video. And in that series, this was the first Viper, hence Mark I. It was a little over 28 feet long. And it had a pretty advanced computerized system and cockpit. It had 2 guns, cannon. In the original series, these were lasers, but in the reimagined, they would have been mass drivers, probably 30 millimeter. That seems to be the common caliber for the Colonials. And we could presume that it could carry some ordnance under the wings, too. Of course, it started off the whole Viper look with 3 wings and engines in the back. And in the real world, when they did Battlestar Galactica in the 70s, this was definitely kind of a riff on the X-Wing. The X-Wing had 4 engines and 4 wings. Well, they did 3 engines and 3 wings and 2 cannons instead of 4. It has the big long nose of the X-Wing. And even the canopy is pretty X-Wing X-Wing-ish. But to be fair, the X-Wing in turn was inspired by World War II aircraft, so it works. It's different enough and iconic enough. And of course, these were launched from tubes on the original Battlestar plans. Now, these craft, before the Cylon War, were kind of used for policing, patrol, border disputes, pirates, that kind of thing. That's why they were pretty heavily reliant on computer systems, something the Cylons quickly exploited. And early in the Cylon War, they would start ripping out computer systems and going back to basics. But this craft, which was designed as a true interceptor fighter, wasn't going to work well having, the guts ripped out of it. But it did in a pinch early in the war. And before the Cylons, it had a good reputation. But afterwards, something was needed for the Cylon War, and that's, of course, where the Mark II comes into play. Big model, too. The Mark II is very heavily based on the Mark I, but it is simplified. It's an almost entirely analog machine with gauges and dials in the cockpit, not computer displays and all that. Still has the same 3-engine design. It's ever so slightly shorter, at just under 28 feet, but it's very close to the same size. And it has more of a primitive look in some aspects, like the canopy is more squared off. Still has the two 30mm cannon. It can carry external ordnance under the wings. Primarily, it can carry the Javelin missile, up to 8 of them, I believe. It also can carry chaff and flare dispensers for countermeasures. Of course, no Viper is capable of FTL. These are sublight, high speed only. And like the Mark I, this was a fighter interceptor. And not only was it simplified and having a lot of the computer systems ripped out to better protect it against the Cylons, also it was so they could mass produce these quickly during the Cylon War. So it's kind of a simplified wartime expedient model. Makes sense, because before a war you can be a little lavish, but during a war you need to cut to basics, and this did. So it cut out all the unnecessaries or weakness points of the Mark I. Didn't have a lot of bells and whistles and flares. It was just a kind of by the stick and pedal fighter. And of course, in the Battlestar universe, they don't have lasers or anything. It's essentially guns, cannons, and guided missiles. Also, nuclear weapons in certain instances. So it really is kind of a reflection of modern style combat, or even 1950s style. But their excuse in universe is the whole Cylons thing, requiring them to get rid of computer systems. And the Mark II quickly became the mainstay early on in the Cylon War. So much so that it earned a very good reputation and would continue in service after the war. But it had been phased out of active service by the time of the series. But this is still the main fighter we see in Season 1, and that's because 40 of these, roughly 2 squadrons, were on board the Galactica as she was about to retire and become a museum ship, just to be there to celebrate the first Cylon War. So the old fighter was put back into service. And luckily, it still used the same cannon ammunition, or rather, newer Vipers still use the same cannon ammunition as this, so a common caliber definitely came into use. It also used the same fuel source and whatnot. So that's why we see the Mark II heavily used at that point early on, because they just happened to be there on Galactica. Otherwise, most of these were retired out in the decades following the first Cylon War. But it definitely earned itself a good reputation. However, it was not perfect. In fact, one of its biggest shortcomings was absolutely not its fault, the fact that it was a dedicated interceptor like the Mark I. Hence, we had the Mark III here. The Mark III is a bit of a return to the Mark I, but also a new direction for the Viper series. After kind of the knee-jerk reaction of taking all computer systems out of the Mark II, for the Mark III, the Colonials decided to add back some computers and displays, more electronic displays in the cockpit, about as much as they were willing to risk. Not as much as the Mark I, but much more than the Mark II. And this was because this was not going to be a fighter interceptor. This was designed, yes, to be a space superiority fighter, sure, but a true multi-role fighter. So think of it as kind of like an F-16. It could fight, it could bomb, it could strike, it could defend. They wanted to kind of give it a bit of flexibility. So it needed to have more abilities. To fulfill this, it was quite a bit larger at over 34 feet long. It was actually large enough that it required modification of the otherwise standard Viper flight launch tubes. So if a Battlestar was going to be launching Mark IIIs here, it would have to have its tubes updated. And this would come online towards the end of the war, but it quickly did make it to front lines the last couple of years. So what's different about it? We still have 2 cannon. The Mark II carried about 800 rounds per cannon. The Mark III would have more rounds, but I don't know exactly how many. But one of its major improvements is it had 2 internal bays for ordnance, missiles, bombs, pods, what have you. So it could carry something inside. It could also hang things under the wings and had targeting systems to better go at the surface or space targets, what have you. So it was a heavier, more complex machine with more systems on board. And it was hoped that it could give an edge to the Colonials and kind of combat the later Cylon ships. Now, in the real world, this was featured quite recently, at least in terms of things, in the aborted Blood and Chrome series. It was a mini-series, but it was the online thing. It was hoped it could be expanded into an actual sequel, or I guess prequel series to the reimagined Galactica. But unfortunately, it didn't come to fruition. Neat design, though, and you can tell that it's a more modern design. It's got a lot more going on. It's a lot busier. And it's a huge model. I think this is probably the biggest of the Vipers. It's heavy, that's for sure. I really like it. Yeah, it's the same Viper shape, but they really were a little more adventurous with it. The Mark I over here, of course, is the classic. It was 1970s space age, so it looks futuristic by the 70s. The Mark II, on the other hand, I think they were intentionally going for more of a retro vibe. And I've said a couple of times, it kind of reminds me of a World War II plane, the framing of the canopy, the cannon, the kind of boxy front end. I don't know, something like a Spitfire or a Mustang. I know it doesn't look like one, but it just kind of reminds me of it. Well, this machine, with kind of the somewhat sleeker edges, but then also more busy work going on, reminds me of maybe a late 50s jet fighter. It definitely has more of a jet aspect, but it doesn't have a modern jet aspect because of having exposed paneling and still a somewhat boxy framing for the cockpit. And it has some various things, doodads on the wings. We could easily say dispensers here. Whatever someone might like, but it's got a lot going on. So it was a bigger, heavier craft, kind of letting the Viper take some of the role of the Raptor. But unfortunately, it was only marginally successful. The Cylons did find ways to hack into these. Of course, they would quickly be patched up, but the computer systems did leave them more vulnerable compared with the Mark II. Also, because of the dangerous roles they were put into, loss rates were pretty high when they came in. Not necessarily directly the fault of the bird, but still yet, they were losing them at a pretty high and alarming number. And this kind of explains, it gives a good excuse in universe why you didn't see Mark IIIs in the reimagined series. They said they were just kind of coming online, just going into mass production towards the end of the war. Many of them were lost. And it's also stated that some of the factories, at least, went back to the simpler Mark II. They were just less susceptible to Cylon tampering. They could crank them out faster. And this is why the Mark II was seen after the war more than the Mark III. And we see this a few times in the real world. For example, in Soviet Russia, they were making the Mosin-Nagant M9130 rifle a bolt action, and they were switching over to the Tokarev SVT-40, a self-loading rifle. And they did produce the Tokarev rifle, but when the war really hit home, literally, they scaled back SVT production and really ramped up Mosin production again because they could produce several Mosin rifles for the cost of one SVT. Likewise, it was easier to train raw recruits on the Mosin compared with the somewhat more finicky SVT-40. So we could also say that the Mark III was maybe a more difficult bird to fly, at least in some people's perceptions. Finally, it did require modification of existing Battlestars, which takes time and resources, whereas the Mark I, Mark II used the traditional flight tubes. But I'm really glad Eaglemoss did this one. It fits in good in the real world. It was meant to bridge the gap between the Mark II and our final. This really is a big one. Stop it. One second. Our final one here, the somewhat controversial Mark VII. Some people like this design, other people do not. And it is a departure from a traditional Viper. I'm just going to arrange this a little better over here, guys. A lot of sticky yeti bits on this one. But yeah, the Mark III was meant to kind of make the Mark VII and Mark II connect a little better. Now, the Mark VII was introduced with the reimagined series in the very first miniseries episodes. So it was there from the beginning, just as the Mark II. But whereas the Mark II was a museum piece, the Mark VII was the current frontline colonial fighter. It doesn't seem like it was brand spanking new. Like maybe it'd been around for 5, 10, 15 years. But it definitely was the newest thing they had. And keeping in mind they were in peacetime, there was probably not a huge push to replace it, spend money, military budgets, what have you. And it has your classic Viper lines. Now this did borrow from the Mark III. It was about 32 feet long, so longer than the Mark II, shorter than the Mark III by a little bit. And like the Mark III, it was designed to be a multi-role fighter, multi-role craft, which would actually come in quite useful during peacetime because this came about decades following the First Cylon War. These were not in that war. And to me, it definitely harkens to like 1980s or 1990s fighters It has elements of like an F-16 to it. Sorry, dust here. It's pollen season here in Arkansas, so it's much sleeker with blended edges. It's kind of a flatter, sleeker looking design with more modern styled engine thrusters. So they definitely tried to make this the current and make you understand this was new, the Mark II was old. And much as they started to do with the Mark III, this has a return to a lot of computer systems, including digital displays, touchscreens, whatnot in the cockpit. It only had 1 or 2 gauges or dials in the cockpit. Everything else was digital. Again, we have kind of a frameless canopy here, which is definitely F-16 style. That was one of the big things when the F-16 came out in the 70s, that the cockpit didn't have all the framework. Really does remind me. Its primary armament are 3 30mm cannon, each with 1,000 rounds. So 3 guns instead of 2, and an extra 200 rounds compared with the Mark II. And one interesting thing, the cannon are further out on the wings now. This has advantages and disadvantages. Advantage means you have your shots spreading out more, which means you might hit a target. But disadvantage, it's hard to sight. So, yeah. Whereas the other Vipers are more tucked in. It also has some sensor probes and chaff and flare launchers. And this also features electronic countermeasures, jamming and what have you. So again, more of a computerized system there. It also can carry ordnance under the wings, and I do believe it's said to have at least 1 internal bay for carrying ordnance also, but I could be wrong on that. And again, still, it is not FTL capable. This is a sublight craft, although it is quite maneuverable. Of course, the computer systems on these were vulnerable because of the back door that Baltar let in. So many Vipers Mark VIIs were destroyed. Luckily, they could disable the computer systems, kind of like they had done originally with the Mark Is. But thankfully, the Mark VII wasn't as dependent on computers as the Mark I. So when they disabled some systems, they were still a very effective fighter. Whereas Galactica had about 40 Mark IIs, it seems like after the fall, collecting a few people, including Apollo, it had about 6, maybe 8 Mark VIIs on board. So that was the flight wing for Galactica in Season 1, under 50 planes, 50 birds. Now when we meet the Pegasus in Season 2, she's almost exclusively flying Mark VIIs and has a large number. And on top of that, she has the ability to manufacture brand new Mark VIIs. And that's another thing to add to the design's credit. It was designed in such a way that it could be manufactured by a large ship like a Battlestar, only scooping up raw materials from, say, asteroids or passing comets or even planets. So that's a good aspect when you can put something together on a ship like that. So again, kind of harkening back to the Mark II's simplicity there. And I'm sure they were even easier to manufacture when they didn't have to bother with the computer systems. So I guess a win-win there. And this explains why, as the series goes on, Season 3 and into 4, the Mark VII starts to really replace the Mark II. So much so that by Season 4, there aren't that many Mark IIs left. Now, in the real world, there were a couple of different models of this. There was a full-size partial mock-up for hangar scenes, and then there was an early CGI. Later, the CGI was updated with more detailing and slightly different coloration and things. So there are 2 variations of the Mark VII scene in the series. But really, it was just kind of a CGI update that many craft in that show received. I think it was between Seasons 2 and 3, but it might have been halfway through Season 2. Let me know. I'm not really good with visual things like that. I don't know why. But, yeah, the Mark VII. Like I said, it's kind of a love it or hate it Viper. But, honestly, I like it. It's not my favorite, but I like it. What do you think? And let's end here by talking about the models and somewhat the design themselves. The Mark I is a neat model. I like the stand because it has these pegs it can plug into. Very good fit. Of course, like most Eaglemosses, it has this base with the felt on it and a little tag. I like Eaglemoss stands. And this one just, yeah, plugs in here between the little winglets, guns, and the engines, and is not going anywhere. It's relatively weighty, but it does have some polymer. I think they say it's like ABS polymer, whatever. The central body's metal, the wings, polymer, engines, polymer. That's basically the whole central body is the metal. I really like kind of the odd framing of the canopy on this. It's pretty neat. But yeah, it's a very good size. It's a shame that Eaglemoss doesn't do moving or swappable parts, like gear up or down, canopy open, closed. But they don't. The Eaglemoss are all just fixed. They don't have moving components. Even things like their birds of prey, they just don't. So, unless Hobby Master wants to get the license and do these, that's kind of just where we're at. I can get this back on here now. Come on, here we go. Again, it sits on there very well. I like that. As for our Mark II, this was where the collection began. Now, it doesn't sit on its stand as well. It just kind of cradles in here and just sits. So it can easily be pushed forward or back a bit. It's not going to go anywhere unless you knock it, but I think they learned from this and came up with the Mark I style stand. That's alright though. This one is heavier. The wings are still the polymer. But because this is a relatively plain body, this is all metal. So it's got some pretty good weight to it. Even this here is metal. So it's a very good size, good weight. And again, really the only downside would be the kind of stand and the fact that you can't do gear up or down, which that's just how it is. Yeah, so it. The next one we got both in Universe and from Eaglemoss, of course, is our Mark VII. This one has a pretty good stand. Has a couple of lips that keep it from moving around too much, but it's still not as secure as the Mark I. But it's pretty good. Unless you bounce it, it's not going to go anywhere. Kind of slots in there. Now, this one is actually one of the few that seems a little small to me. But I think that's somewhat deceptive, because it is actually quite long. It's just such a slender, kind of almost delicate, agile look to it that I think it comes across as smaller than it really is, because front to back it does have some good length. But it is lighter. It's the lightest of the three I've picked up so far because of the more detailed orientation of it and the slimmer body. The central part, again, is metal, including here. Back here is still metal. Then you get to the wings, and they become polymer. The back is polymer. So it still has some decent weight. It's still definitely die cast. But It is the lightest of the ones here. I was really happy they did a Mark VII. I was very excited when it came out. And I'm not disappointed. I'm not. I like it. I guess it met expectations, but it didn't exceed them. Whereas like the Mark I and the Mark II were just really impressive. This was pretty much, yeah, met expectations. I wasn't bowled over, but I wasn't disappointed. So it's a passing grade, but I feel like they could have scaled it up just a little bit more. Something. And I think they maybe felt that too, because that's pretty much exactly what they did with our most recent Mark III here. This one's crazy. Now this one also has some patterning in the thing here that keeps it from moving. And it is just, it's just impressive. It's the heaviest of all of them. The central body, which is huge on this, is metal. Even the front grille here is metal intake. Of course, as usual, our wings are polymer. And our engines. But just because of how large the main body is on this, it is decidedly the weightiest. And I like how the cannon are very reminiscent of the Mark I, the way they kind of angle out. I like that there's some stuff going on with the wings. And really, I think this is probably my favorite of the canopies, how it's more rounded, but it's also framed. It's just a good in-between. And I like how they have these sections here, like the Mark II. But then this top part is more curvy, like the Mark VII. And it's just big. It is the biggest of the bunch, which makes sense because in the show, this was the biggest of the Vipers. It's a shame that Blood and Chrome didn't take off to any extent, because it could have been interesting. I mean, it was so, look at the mini-series for the Reimagined. It was good, but they definitely got a lot better, the acting and the roles as time went on. That's one I really hope they do with the new issues, is the Galactica from, where am I at here? Is from Blood and Chrome's Galactica. I'd also like to see, what is it, the Osiris? Any new Battlestars I really like. And when I first started getting this collection, I mostly got it for the Battlestars. And I like them. The Pegasus and the Valkyrie in particular are awesome. But I have to admit, the Vipers have become my favorite. And I didn't expect that. But I really like them. They knocked it out of the park on size and everything with these. I want to say the Mark I's my favorite, but I think that might just be nostalgia. The Mark III is just neat. And maybe it's because no one else really has done a full kind of sized Mark III, at least not yet. And it was just kind of unexpected in a cool, good way. The Mark VII and Mark II, there was the Titanium series from Galoob or whatever, Hasbro, years ago. So we've seen these a couple of times in the past, along with the Mark I. So if anything else, the Mark III is just unique because people don't typically make models of it because it's a new show. And the Mark II is just a classic. And they've done a few paint schemes for the Mark II. They've done Starbuck a couple of different ways of hers. And they've done Adama's Husker, not Apollo. So this one they've done a few variations on. I don't think the others they have, but I could be wrong. So which one do you like the most out of the four? And like I said at the beginning, what would you like to see in upcoming issues, assuming plans go forward and they do expand the collection? I'm also interested to see what they do with the Stargate collection. That'll be interesting. I'd be in for that. I don't know, I just felt like talking about BSG. I wish I had 4 brand new models to show you that you'd never seen before, but this is what we got. And hey, they were sitting on the shelf, and I just thought it would be relaxing. I'm relaxed. I hope you're relaxed too. As always, if you have any questions, please do post them. And if you could, like, share, and subscribe. This is Misha, and I'll catch you very soon, hopefully with some new models next time.